good evening, everybody. Sorry we're a little bit late. We were just getting our guests all up to speed on how this show works. So welcome to The Agronomists, Lyndsey Smith. Once again, Sean Haney's back next week. So if you really miss him, save all your love for next week, if you don't mind. Okay, so before I bring my guests in, just a quick lay of the land of how this works. Shout out quickly to Viren. There will be no sea shanties on this episode of The Agronomist, at least from me. I cannot guarantee from our guests. But as always, you can comment. We love comments, questions. Bring it on for our guests. We're going to talk about seedling diseases, mostly in cereals and pulses, but these two are rather brilliant, so challenge them for sure. You can watch us, of course, on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. Just post your comments on in there, and I'll try and get to as many as I can. And of course, you can get CEU credits for watching this episode of The Agronomist. So tune into realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow to sign up for those credits. And of course, you can sign up for our e-newsletter there as well, so that you get a reminder and you don't forget. I'm going to bring in my guests now. We've got Kelly Turkington and Robyne Bowness Davidson. Well, we did it. We made it.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Robyne. Okay, so Kelly, to start off, you're both in Alberta, and so this show, of course, goes across Canada. Last week we had guests from, we had questions from Brazil and all over the U.S. So, of course, all are welcome. But for those who aren't familiar with each of your areas of expertise, Kelly, let's start with you. I hear you do cereals.
Yes. So currently I work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada here in Lacombe, Alberta. The main focus that we have is on cereal diseases. We do a lot of work with mainly barley breeders, but a bit with some of the wheat breeders in terms of screening for resistance. And then another sort of major area that we have is looking at integrated crop and pest management strategies with colleagues that work in agronomy and weed science.
Okay. And Robyne, you are here representing the pulse industry. Tell us about your role.
Well, I currently work at the moment anyway for Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. And my focus has been pulse crops for probably the past 10 years or so, running research trials on various, different things, looking at agronomy and a lot of pathology as well. So, and as well as looking at some of the newer, more questionable pulse crops maybe, and trying to bring them into some of our Alberta areas. So been just running research all over the province for the past little while.
Okay. We're maybe going to get into some of those fringes. I'd love
maybe.
to know what some of the exciting pulse crops are. Johnson says that my internet is sketchy. I know. Thanks. I live in a rural area. We're trying our best, and I may or may not have a 3-year-old on YouTube right now to keep her busy. So there you go. Okay, now, so how this works, what we do here at The Agronomist, we've got, of course, our 2 experts here. We'll take questions from the audience, but we also are going to dip into the archives, head back into our wheat school, into our pulse school, look at some past episodes, and discuss some of that stuff there. But before we head to that, I've got a question for each of you. I'm going to start with you, Kelly. Alberta especially, but big parts of the prairies are quite dry heading into the seeding season. Does that mean I don't have to worry about any sort of seed treatment on my cereals?
No, unfortunately, because things can change quite dramatically next spring. We could get some late winter, early spring rain or snowstorms. The other thing is you have to always look at your seed source and what is on there. So we have people are quite familiar with using germination assessments to look at seed quality, but I think one area that also needs to be looked at is basically a fungal screen on the seed itself, what pathogens are present, because some of those issues could result in significant issues with seed and seedling disease, and other pathogens actually can move from the seed onto the seedling and up with the growing plant. So the smuts, bunts, and so on can do that. But some of the foliar diseases that we see in cereals, for example, netform, net blotch, and in barley, can move from the seed to the seedling and then onto the young leaves and then cycle on that barley crop.
Okay. Smuts and bunts, some of my favorite words when it comes to pathology. So there you go. I also like sclerotia. That's a good one too. I like that one a lot. All right. Now for you, Robyne, when we think pulse crops, I don't know. I always sort of think a lot of different disease side, but of course we are dealing with the Aphanomyces, the whole root rot, larger issues. So where are we at? Does this dry weather help us out in navigating potential seedling issues for pulses?
I would say not necessarily, no, because like Kelly said, things can change very quickly. When it comes to the majority of the seedling diseases that are problematic for pulse crops, they're in the soil. They're waiting, and if we have the right conditions, they will attack. So I would say, especially Aphanomyces, it is just waiting in the soil right now for the right conditions, for a host to show up and for some moisture to be there, as well as some of the other ones. So if they're there and we get some rains at just the right time and there's no seed treatment to protect them, I would say this dry weather is not necessarily going to be helping us at all.
All right. I was hoping for some good news. I didn't get much, but that's okay. We'll work on the good news spin of all this. But now there are lots of comments rolling in, which I love. Most of them have to do with the weather. So I do feel we should just name it right now that it is bitterly cold across the prairies right now. It's not terribly warm in Ontario either, I'll have you know. I'm bundled right up. I have wool socks on and a heating pad, but that might have to do more with age than the temperature. But for any of you watching in Brazil or from the States or anything like that, so incredibly cold. So let's all try and stay warm here tonight. Pete Johnson does have a comment here that he's pushing hard for growers to get seeding extra early with a dry spring. Kelly, is that better or worse for seedling issues on cereals?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and it's one that we get a lot. Often you'll hear the comment that seeding into cool, wet soils favors seedling disease issues. Actually, that may help to limit the impact of seedling issues, because a lot of the pathogens that affect cereals, let's say, their optimum temperature range in terms of growth is probably in that 15 to 20 C range. So seeding early, as long as you have good germination, good vigor in your cereal seed, may actually help to limit some of the impacts of some of these seed-borne disease issues or soil-borne. A very good example of that would be Fusarium graminearum. And often the recommendation, if you're looking at a winter cereal, is to delay actually further into the fall when soil temperatures are decreased, because seeding into a warmer seed bed actually will increase your risk of seed and seedling issues. Conversely, if you're looking at a spring cereal, going in really early, if you've got good quality seed, good vigor, you've used a good product to treat, that may actually provide some benefit as far as limiting these soil-borne pathogens, or in some cases like graminearum, seed-borne.
Okay. I'm going to apologize. I'm glad my guests can at least somewhat hear me, but we're trying to navigate my very poor internet. So I apologize to everyone if I sound like a robot. I think what we're going to do is we're going to go, which is, so Sean Haney goes through our archives and chooses these. And for the most part, I mean, the subject is there, but they seem to all be kind of ancient. And so I will warn you now that we have improved our sound and video quality a lot here at Real Agriculture. And so we're going to go to our first clip here with Faye, who I haven't heard from in forever, to talk about some pulse seedling issues and testing seeds. So we'll head to that now.
Well, it's important to seed test so that you know what you have before it goes into the ground. So test to see what your germination levels are, vigor, and then of course the disease levels that you might have in your pulses, so that you can make the proper management decisions even prior to the seed going in, so such as using a seed treatment. So it's just really important to know what the condition is of your seed, and that'll help you manage the crop throughout the season.
What could be wrong with it?
Well, the big issue that you'll see in seed testing labs would be diseases. So you'll get a report back from your seed test that tells you what diseases are present, perhaps even what other things are growing on the seed, such as saprophytes, that won't be as big of an issue, but you'll go through your seed testing results, and from there you can make a decision whether or not you want to use that seed, or whether you want to use a seed treatment, or whether everything's just good to go.
So what are some of the diseases that we might see on that seed test?
Well, some diseases that you might see on any of the pulses, so chickpeas, lentils, peas, would be things like botrytis, sclerotinia, and fusarium. And for any of those, you wouldn't want more than 10% total of all of those diseases present. So we do have some plates here that show, for example, what botrytis looks like on lentils. We also have sclerotinia on lentil. And then fusarium as well, which would be possible to show up. That would be kind of a pinkish colored growing on the plate. So as I said, total 10% for those. Anything above that, you'd want to use a seed treatment for any of your pulses. So we also have ascochyta blight. We know that those show up on our crops during the field season. That's something that we'd consider using a fungicide application on later on in the season, but those can also show up in our seed. So if you had an ascochyta problem in your crop, it might be showing up in your seed. For those, we do have an example on peas, ascochyta on peas. If you had more than 10% of that, 10% ascochyta in your pea sample, you'd want to use a seed treatment. If you have more than 5% ascochyta blight on your lentils, you'd want to use a seed treatment. And for chickpeas, there's a really low threshold because you can't even get crop insurance if you have too much ascochyta on chickpeas, just because it's such an aggressive species on chickpeas. So 0.3% would be our maximum for that.
Do some people just still not treat their seed because they see lower levels?
I think that using a seed treatment is becoming more and more popular, and it's kind of a extra insurance that you can put onto your seed before it goes into the ground, because if you have adverse conditions after seeding before the crop really gets off to a good start, then just having that extra seed treatment there to protect your seed until it can get strong enough to resist some of the environmental things that are out there that can be helpful. Also keep in mind that there could be diseases in the soil, so even if you have a low level of disease in your seed, you could still have diseases out there that could be affecting your seedlings, especially, again, as I said, if there's adverse conditions in the field.
Are there diseases that we're expecting to see in higher numbers this year as compared to last year?
Actually, it looks like the seed from 2013 was pretty good overall. We know it was a record crop and that there wasn't a lot of major disease issues during the field season, and that seems to be reflected in the seed testing results from this year as well. For example, we have a plate here that says squeaky clean lentils. Really no disease showing up on any of the plates here in a few of these samples, and that wasn't uncommon in seed tests this year, which is great. So there's nothing that's causing a major red flag in terms of the seed testing labs. We do see, for example, on lentils, we'll see anthracnose showing up in seed tests. Generally, anthracnose isn't a major disease concern going from seed to seedlings, but we know that if there's anthracnose showing up in the seed, that there's probably anthracnose out there in the field. And that is probably one of the more common diseases that we see on lentils during the season. So it's pretty safe to assume that there'd be some anthracnose out there. If you have a good long crop rotation, then it's not going to be as much of an issue. But if you have a shorter rotation, or you know that you've had anthracnose in your fields before, then that might be one to watch out for, because we do see it every year. As well as sclerotinia, because sclerotinia can infect any of our pulses, as well as canola, flax. It's something that can be showing up throughout our rotation. So if we get a wet year, we can be pretty confident that sclerotinia will be an issue. So it's not so much something that's going to be flagging because of what we've had last year, but just the diseases that we know that can be an issue, and if we get wet conditions at the right time, then it would be more of a problem.
When should we get our pulse seed tested?
Well, the seed can be tested any time before it's planted. There's usually kind of a peak season maybe in the seed testing labs where lots of seed is getting tested, but it actually only takes about 5 days for the seed test itself. So it could be done shortly before seeding, but any time after harvest you can have the seed tested and see what diseases are there.
The eternal question of when should we get a seed test, which we will get to in a moment. I did want to just send out a shout out there that the voice you heard there was Deborah Murphy, who is on leave right now, and it was lovely to hear her voice. Now, that of course is a video from back before Aphanomyces was really rearing its ugly head. So I'll go to you though, Robyne. How important is a seed test ahead of the growing season for pulses?
Well, if you're talking about Aphanomyces, Lyndsey, a seed test isn't going to help you per se, because Aphanomyces is not a disease that is in the seed. It is a soil-borne disease. So there is a possibility that you could pick up Aphanomyces off on the soil tag as you are getting it tested, but it's not going to help you to decide whether or not Aphanomyces is going to be a problem as a seed test. Unfortunately, most of the seedling diseases that attack pulses are soil-borne. We do have downy mildew, which would be one that if the seed's coming off a wet year, that perhaps could create an issue, and you could have it tested for that. But the rhizoctonias, the fusariums, the pythiums, and most of the diseases that really create a problem for the pulse seedlings and the seed as it germinates are in the soil already. So I think it's very important to have it tested so that you know that your seed is clean as far as it doesn't have any storage diseases on it, or ascochyta can become an issue from the year before. So if you had high levels of ascochyta when the seed was harvested and it went into the bin with ascochyta on it, then that is something you should definitely test for. But I think, as Kelly alluded to earlier, it's also the vigor and the whole, any other damages that could be on the seed as well. So not just the diseases, but mechanical damage and some of the things like that. So I think it's very important to have your seed tested regardless what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And Robyne, you've hit on a couple things I do want to talk about as far as either, more on the cereal side, frost or sprout damage, but also, on the pulse side with mechanical damage or chemical damage, those sorts of things. And we did have, Peter did ask, and I want to ask this as well. If, let's say, we sent in our seed lot, let's say late in the fall, should we be retesting ahead of the seeding season? Let's first talk pulses, but then Kelly, I want to go to you on this one as well.
I would say not necessarily, no. I think if the seed has any seed-borne diseases in it, or there is maybe ascochyta, like I mentioned, or anything like that that's on the seed, it's going to be there as it comes off the combine and goes into the bin. So I don't think it's necessary. I think it's more important to emphasize the fact that you have it tested than you worry about when the test was taken.
Okay. Now, and Kelly, as we look at our cereals, what are we looking for there as far as testing, and are there any factors that you would suggest requires a retest closer to seeding season?
Well, we're in a similar situation to the pulses. So we have soil-borne issues that you wouldn't expect to see on the seed. So things like Pythium, Rhizoctonia, some potential Fusarium species that are largely soil-borne and root pathogens. I would say it's important to look at the mother crop. So the crop year from which the seed was produced and what kind of conditions you have at the end of the growing season. If we look at 2016, for instance, or maybe in some areas 2019 in the prairies, we had a lot of wet conditions, delayed harvest. So you get a lot of microbial growth on that plant material, extensive weathering, and maybe even the beginnings of some pre-germination in the seed. And as that's in the bin over the winter, definitely there could be a reduction in germination and vigor. So if you see conditions like that in the fall, the late summer and fall, you might want to look at retesting closer to seeding, just to make sure that germination has been maintained and vigor. But it would really depend on the conditions in the mother crop at the time of harvest. Certainly there's very specific issues that you'd want to look at. In barley, your main issues would be Fusarium graminearum and also the spot blotch fungus, or Cochleobolus sativus. Those are two of the pathogens in barley that cause a lot of issues as far as germination, emergence, and stand establishment. In wheat, it would primarily be Fusarium graminearum. Spot blotch, or Cochleobolus sativus, isn't as much of an issue in wheat. In some countries it is. Certainly here in Western Canada, it tends not to be as much of an issue. And certainly where you see concerns regarding seed health and seed performance, it's really that Cochleobolus sativus in barley, and then Fusarium graminearum. And then the other thing would be, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, no, you finish, because I want to move to some of the comments that are coming in and move into seed treatment.
Sure. And then the other thing would be pathogens that have the ability to transfer from the seed to the seedling, whether that's the bunts and smuts or some of the leaf spot diseases. So especially netform, net blotch, and barley is one that can move readily from the seed to the seedling and then cycle on that barley crop during the growing season. In wheat, tan spot, it's not really well known. I would say more the gloom blotch fungus, or Parastagnospora nodorum. If you have a lot of seed infection there, it can cause issues with seed germination and seed performance, but there may also be some seed to seedling transmission. But in the grand scheme of things, some of these seed-borne issues like netform, net blotch, or the Septoria fungus, especially gloom blotch, the tight rotations that we're using, really the main source of disease is going to be from that old infested residue in the field.
Right. Robyne, so when we talk about, with so many of our seedling issues living in the soil already, and so of course conditions are going to have to be conducive to pathogen growth and those sorts of things, but it, in my mind, then makes rotation really important, but also seed treatment. So how effective, how good are the tools we have as far as the seed treatment is concerned against some of the major seedling issues out there?
Well, for the root rot complex that we refer to, and that would be your Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and your Pythium, as well as any Ascochyta that might be on the seed from the year before, our seed treatments work quite well. I think we have a number of different products that are available from a number of different companies. I think if we use those treatments and we apply them properly and do everything else correctly, make sure we have good seeding conditions and make sure that we're, getting really good coverage, because the pulse seeds can vary from very small to quite large depending on the pulse crop that you're growing. So I would say for the most part, they have good efficacy. So the seed treatments work for those diseases that I mentioned. And so I would say just choose one and use it. and you will definitely see an advantage in your emergence and in your plant stand, and therefore in your yield. Unfortunately, with the Phantomyces, we do not have a seed treatment that we say manages it per se. We have some seed treatments that are registered for suppression. And so I like to refer to suppression as a tool in our toolbox. It's definitely something that you can add into your practices to make sure that the seeds get a very good start. So if it can suppress the disease for a certain amount of time and give the plant a chance to grow and get growing, then it definitely is going to help. Now, unfortunately, suppression means that it may or may not help, and unfortunately, they're not near as effective on a Phantomyces as it would on any of the other ones. So that's the problem with the Phantomyces, is we really don't have any great tools. We have, I like to say, little hammers as opposed to big hammers in our toolbox for Phantomyces. So,
Right, but we probably maybe need like 6,000 more of those little hammers.
we definitely need something to combat this in Phantomyces more than what we have right now, for sure. So
right. Yeah, absolutely. Which let's hope that there's some pretty great research happening as we speak that gets us somewhere. Maybe it moves the needle on that one. Now, we've got lots of questions coming in about the cost of seed treatments and the effectiveness of having good coverage on your seed. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to run to our third clip, though it's running second, just to throw a little loop there for Jay, with Shad Milligan about getting an effective seed treatment on seed. So we'll go to that clip and then we'll discuss some of these questions for sure.
Some of the most important things when you start to treat seed is really the application. The seed treatment technology that has been developed over the years is really gone are the days where you can drip it on or tell if it's more red as it goes out of the end of the auger. Having the right application and the right equipment to do it is vital. You need that first, that primary application of the seed treatment getting on the seed, but you need that secondary application of the mixing, the proper mixing, whether that be an auger or on some of the seed treating machines, a drum type roller. Having that is essential because you need to get the seed treatment technology now, you need to get it to the proper application. So having that right equipment makes it good for the right job.
So good equipment that's calibrated though?
That's one step of the whole process when you are treating seed, is the calibration process. Knowing that, okay, well, at this time of the day I'm doing this much, because over the course of the day temperatures change, relatively humidity changes, and that varies, that will vary what you're treating. So knowing how to run your equipment is also another important aspect of that too. Putting it on, realizing that you may have to adjust your pressure from the time you treat in the morning to the afternoon back until the evening, because as like I've said before, the humidity and temperature play a role in the treating factors.
And so when we talk about good coverage, it's not a visual look. Oh, it looks good to me. Look, we're getting lots on there. If you're measuring it that way, you're probably putting too much on.
Yes and no. You have to take the ownership, and you've got to believe in the calibration that you've done on your machine. You can tell a reference on, you can reference your seed visually and look at it, because what you're looking for in your seed sample is a uniform seed coverage. You want a uniform seed treatment coverage on all seeds. You don't want some with a lot of pigment coloring, or some with none, others with less. You want a uniform application. Looking at that visually, saying that uniform application is really a good indication of how well you're doing as a treating job. And then you can kind of tweak it. But realistically, most of the seed treatment equipment out there, they've done calibrations. You will have your charts. Follow your charts and take the confidence to know that you have to take some confidence in the equipment. But doing the actual calibration yourself, it can be a little bit of a time-consuming process, but doing that is going to ensure that you're getting the right amount of product to ensure the most efficient use of your seed treatment on your seed.
I really hope somewhere that Shad was actually watching this. And also, those seagulls are somewhat terrifying. Oh my goodness. Anyway, These clips are fantastic. Okay. Lots of things to come out of that, but we did have one question come in that I think fits into this quite well. And Kelly, I'll go to you first. Does seed have to be 100% covered for a seed treatment to be effective?
It really depends on the nature of the product. If you were looking at more of a contact seed treatment fungicide, which we really don't see a lot of anymore. So if you go back to look at things like DB Green or Dithane or Maneb, some of those are not systemic. So they're on the surface of the seed. So you'd have to make sure that if you're using that type of product, to make sure you get good, even coverage. With a systemic seed treatment, that may or may not be as critical, but I would say the movement of that seed treatment into some of the internal tissues of that seed can be difficult. It's hard to eradicate well-seeded, deep-seeded infections in the seed. So certainly making sure that you've got adequate rate of product, you've got good coverage, both on an individual seed itself, but between seeds, so you get an adequate concentration of fungicide there in order to manage the issues that you have either on the seed or internally born in the seed. So certainly as a kid, my dad used a drip applicator seed treatment. That is probably not the best technology to be looking at. And you want to look at some of the other later generation application technology that gives you that ability to get more uniform coverage both within a seed and between seeds.
Mm-hmm. Robyne, do you have any thoughts on that side?
No, I don't think so. No, I think Kelly pretty much covered it all. And I would agree. I mean, it's just important that you get the right rate on, you get the seed covered as well as you can so that it can do its job the best of its ability.
Give it all you got. Okay, now of course, seed treatments are a cost. Now, most would consider it sort of an insurance cost more so than an investment cost, maybe. But we do have a question from Jason here, saying that the cost has become a major expense with application fees, and they've always applied it on their farm, but they've been experimenting, seeing equal amounts of both smut and ergot in Durham on both treated and not treated this past harvest. Now, I don't know where he farms, but not sure if the effort is worth it, but is there a surefire product to help with this ergot issue?
Oh, unfortunately, in terms of seed treatment, it's really, the seed isn't the right target in terms of ergot management. So the ergot survives either on the soil surface or within the soil as these sclerotial bodies. So in terms of the risk of infection, it really depends on weather conditions at head emergence and then further head development and seed development, whether you have the moisture that will facilitate germination of sclerotia, production of the drumstick type structures that the ergot pathogen produces, dispersal of those spores, landing of the spores in the head, and access of this of those spores to the actual sort of female reproductive parts of that cereal plant. So any stress in terms of late herbicide application, you have either extremely dry, hot conditions, or conversely extremely cold conditions as the crop is starting to head, or you have deficiencies and bona fide deficiencies in things like copper, boron, and so on. Those factors will have an effect on pollen viability, and anything that affects pollen viability can cause the flowering part of that plant, the florets, to open up to try and provide some access to that female reproductive tissue, to any pollen that might be floating around in the air. Problem with that is it also exposes that floret to ascospores of the ergot fungus. So in terms of seed treatment, traditionally with ergot, it's recommended in terms of applying it onto ergot bodies that are in the harvested grain and in the seed that you're intending on seeding. But most of the inoculum, because if you're planting that ergot body 1 to 2 inches or more below the soil surface, it's not typically going to contribute to that epidemic. It needs to be either on the soil surface or slightly below. And so the seed treatment is really to try and kill that ergot body. But that ergot body in the seed is really not necessarily having a huge impact on in-season risk. It's some of these other factors that are occurring.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought up the deficiency part, because we've certainly talked about it on this show before. And Pete, of course, has brought it up as well, about that pollination factor for ergot.
Definitely. And, if you look at the range of cereal species, of things like rye and triticale tend to be more susceptible. And one of the reasons is they have more of an open flower or floret type structure, which gives easier access to those ergot ascospores that are floating around in the air. If you start to move to wheat and barley, they tend to be a bit more self-pollinated. So the anthers that are within that floret will pollinate that ovary. But if you have these stress issues or deficiencies, that may facilitate more flower opening in wheat and barley, and as a consequence, more of an ergot issue in those crops.
Okay. Robyne, I want to go to you. I want to talk, we've focused a lot on seed itself, on seed lots and those sorts of things. But of course, we are talking about when these plants start to grow and some of the seedling diseases and issues we're going to see early in the season. How important then is that early scouting? And what sorts of things would you see early on in the season that would sort of key you in to say, I need to come back to this field and watch this field? This could be an issue later.
Okay. Well, I think scouting is important from the minute you put it in the seed or when you put it in the ground and it starts to come up. Because I think one of the most important things that leads to a successful crop, therefore money in your pockets and seed in the bin, is a really good plant stand. You need a good plant stand. You need a high amount of vigorous, healthy plants growing, or you're going to have problems for the entire season. So I think scouting is very important. And so if you're going into your field shortly after it's starting to emerge and you're seeing a lot of uneven emergence, where you see some plants coming up and some of them not coming up at all. Now, pulse crops can vary a little bit in their emergence. But if you see a big difference, there might be an issue. You can see some of them coming up, but they seem to be struggling. They don't look very healthy. They don't look very happy. And if you dig them up, you might find that some of the roots are starting to have some issues. And as well as, just overall stunting, yellowing, chlorotic areas. The plants, they seem to grow and then they kind of gave up. There's all kinds of different, signs and symptoms that you can look for to get an idea of whether or not you might have some issues in that field. Now, unfortunately, if you see those issues, it's probably too late to do anything about them. But you might be able to, at least going forward, do whatever else you can to give that, the field and those plants that are struggling a chance to grow. So I think it's very important to take the time early in the season to make sure that you are using, like we've said a number of times, good seed, make sure you get into the good depth and make sure you're picking the right fields, all those best management practices. And the Phantomyces, like I said, it's important to also know and can be scouting throughout the entire season with the Phantomyces, because it tends to come in early. But some of these diseases are there early on and the seed treatments protect them, but then catch up to them later. So it's very important to know what's in your field, because if it's a Phantomyces, then that field is not going to be able to have peas or lentils for the next 6 to 8 years.
Which is a long time.
Especially when, yeah.
It's a long time. No, but there are a few pulse options that are less susceptible to Phantomyces. What are we learning about that?
Well, we have learned that peas and lentils are the ones that struggle the most, and they are the ones that a Phantomyces is very devastating. Now, if you're in an area where chickpeas is an option, chickpeas tends to not resistant. Resistant isn't the right word, because resistant means that we will find a Phanomyces on the chickpea roots, but it's unable to complete its life cycle, so therefore it does not affect the plant. Faba beans, if you're in an area of the province where you have the ability to, more wetter, heavier soil to grow faba beans is resistant. That means when the Phanomyces cell spores, if they're there, they are unable to infect. So you do have some options. Soybeans is another one that I don't necessarily think is great for Alberta at this time, but for our viewers that are turning in from other areas where soybean is an option, that is definitely an option as well. So we do have some options. Luckily, we talk about crop rotation and rotating, into a pulse crop, but you can also rotate your pulse crops.
All right, excellent reminder. And I happen to like faba beans, so I'm, anytime that we could maybe add some of them. All right, Kelly, I want to go to you. There's a question in the comments here from Kara. Now that Fusarium graminearum is off the Pest Act in Alberta, which perhaps people in other parts of the world didn't know that Alberta has no rats and no Fusarium, but that's changing, I guess, on the Fusarium side. Anyway, but now that Fusarium graminearum has been taken off the Pest Act, what does that really mean for producers? Oh, Kelly, I think you're muted.
I did
That's
mute
okay.
because
Yeah, there we
had
go.
a bit of a ticklish throat.
Yeah. That's okay.
So for producers, the biggest impact would be access to new genetics, I think. With it being on the Pest Act, it meant that you couldn't market a plant tissue, in this case seed, with this known designated pest. So as the pathogen became more established in Alberta in the mid-2000s and late 2000s, especially in southern Alberta, a lot of seed growers were having difficulties producing seed without any detectable level of graminearum. The issue is that in those areas where you have the pathogen well established on residues, introducing it on the seed is really a minor problem. Your main focus there is going to be in terms of seed performance. Is the level of infection high enough? Has it impacted germination? And will I see seed performance issues? So that'll be the biggest probably impact. There may be an impact in terms of the ability to do some research where you're inoculating disease resistance screening nurseries, for example, or other trials looking at seed treatments or in-crop fungicides. But for farmers, I think the biggest impact will be in terms of faster access to some of the new genetics that we see coming down the pipeline.
All right. And if any farmers in Alberta are looking for tips on how to manage for Fusarium head blight, Manitoba has years of experience and Ontario probably even more. So just look to your friends to the east and we'll let you know just how great the pink fuzz is. It's not great. Sorry. Okay, so question here from Jason, and I'm going to add to this question. So Robyne, this one's for you because I'm less concerned of the seed treatment, but he asks, can you apply too much seed treatment that would actually hurt the germination of the seed? My question is, on top of that, or adding to this, what about inoculants? Do we have to worry about inoculant for our pulse crops and seed treatment interaction?
And I think that's an important point. The first part of the question about can you add too much seed treatment to actually hurt the germination? I don't think so. Now, there is probably a rate where if you go to that point, you could potentially cause some issues because anything beyond a certain level is going to be problematic. But I don't believe you're hurting anything besides your pocketbook when you do that. As we have talked about, seed treatments are quite expensive. So it's important to get them on at the right rate so they can do their job. Too much, I don't think would be a problem, like I said, unless you went too high. And as far as inoculants, I think the companies in general have done a very good job at making sure that their seed treatments and the inoculants are quite compatible. But it is definitely something that you should check on, especially with the inoculants. The inoculants are ever changing. They're a live bacteria that you're putting into the ground with the pulse crop. So depending on the formulation, depending on the company, depending on a number of factors, depending on how much seed treatment you put on and what that seed treatment is, the active ingredient in that seed treatment, there is definitely a possibility that you could have some antagonism. So it's something that you should check with the inoculant companies and the seed companies to make sure. Now, it's not a big problem. It's not something we see a lot of, but it is something to keep definitely mindful of, Lyndsey.
Okay, good. And I mean, and as you said, every treatment or input costs money. So let's make sure we're using the right rate, and of course not potentially sort of shooting ourselves in the foot if there is an incompatibility issue. We're running out of time, but I did want to get to our last clip because I think it does sum up a lot of what we're talking about here tonight about figuring out the root cause of an issue potentially if you're seeing some issues in seedlings. So we're going to go. This is a wheat school, I believe, with Jeremy Boychin, which Kara reminds me that there will be a wheat school coming out this week on the fusarium topic if anybody is curious. So watch Real Agriculture for that. But let's head to this clip. And this might be the most recent clip we've ever used on this show because I think it's from December. All right, let's see what Jeremy Boychin has to say here.
Testing your wheat seed for fungal disease is important for a few reasons. If you just get a test that's going to give you germination and vigor, and your germination is down, it's not going to really give you a good idea of maybe why that germination is down. And you may be increasing your seeding rates based on that low germination, but you may be able to address that problem better if you have an idea of what diseases are in that seed. So it just helps producers better manage that seed or make more appropriate decisions around how to manage either through seed treatment or choosing a different seed lot based on the results that come back from that fungal testing.
So how do producers go about collecting seed to be tested? Can you talk a bit about that process?
So they would be collecting it the same way that they would be looking to collect it to send it into a grain elevator or to the grain sample program with CGC. They want to make sure that they're collecting a distributed sample of their grain. That way they're getting a good idea of what the entire grain lot looks like. And then they're going to be submitting it to whatever seed testing lab that they want. There's a few different options in Western Canada. So pick one that you like to work with and send it into them, and they'll send you their results right back.
So when you get these results back, there can be long lists of things you're seeing. Can you talk a bit about certain levels of infections that actually warrant addressing?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that comes up every year. There's a variety of different results that pop up when you're doing a fungi test. Aspergillus is on there, penicillium is on there, Alternaria is on there, Cladosporium, Epicoccum, Cochleobis. All of these things are on there. And the question is okay, at what number do I need to actually address these, or which of these is actually impacting my germination? Because that's the question we want to ask. Because when we're looking at these, if our germination rates are low, we want to make sure we're looking at these properly and saying, okay, I'm addressing these so I can get my germination right, so I can put the correct amount of seed in the ground. So knowing which of these funguses are actually affecting germination is going to be important. And in general, you can lump all of these into three different categories. You have your weak pathogens, you have your storage pathogens, and then you have your pathogenic pathogens. So your storage pathogens are going to be Aspergillus and Penicillium. And in general, these do not cause an impact to your germination. What these are is they're a storage mold. If your seed goes into the bin when it's wet and warm, and there's already some of that those fungi in there, it'll continue to grow, and then you'll actually start to see bin burnt seed. So if you get these numbers back and they're somewhere between 10 to 15% and your germination is a little bit lower than you think it should be, then potentially this is causing an issue. And actually there is some seed treatment that can be used to mitigate some of that. The other group that you can see is your weak pathogens, and that's going to be Alternaria, Cladosporum, and Epicoccum. And these are actually, if you drive around in the fall and you see crop that's been swathed, or it's really late to be harvested, and you see it start to go from that golden brown to that dark kind of like really brownish, darkish brown color. That's those diseases taking over the plant tissue. So it's what they're called are saprophytes, and they only really attack dead tissue. So when it comes to germinating seed, typically they are not going to cause any concern. I mean, you can get cumulative infection levels of these three up to 50% without really causing any issues. If you have it above 50% and you're seeing some germination issues as well, then potentially there's some concern there. But most likely, even if those numbers are high, you're not going to see too many issues in terms of germination. But if you do, it's probably a good idea to call the seed lab and see what they think. And then the last ones that are on there are Cochleobus, Fusarium graminearum, Pyrenophora, and the last one I always screw up, Parastagnosporum. These 5 remaining ones are your pathogenic fungi, and these are the ones that typically cause the most impact to germination. So Fusarium graminearum is kind of a whole different monster, and the way you manage that is going to be highly dependent on where you are in the province or where you are in Western Canada. So I don't want to touch on that yet. If you want more information and you're in Alberta, head to managefhb.ca, and there's a ton of information there. But for the other ones on there.
All right. So there's tons of information in that particular wheat school, but we've covered many of it, but he does touch on a few things that I want to come back to, and the questions actually dovetail into this very nicely. So one of the things that he, of course, does mention is getting to the root cause of, if you get back a seed test that's maybe questionable, the importance of figuring out exactly what you're dealing with. And Robyne, I want to go to you first on the pulse side. When it comes to chemical damage or mechanical damage, obviously these aren't things that we can overcome. So Peter Johnson has asked a question, would you actually choose a different seed lot based on test results and disease levels? So when are those instances where you might actually say, look, it's time to source a different seed lot for this particular pulse crop?
Well, for the actual diseases themselves, Lyndsey, I would say that the threshold for the majority of them will be about 10%. So if 10% of your seed is coming back with a lot of storage molds, although like Jeremy said, the storage molds don't necessarily tend to be that problematic. But if your seed is just not healthy looking because of it, or it doesn't have a good vigor or whatever because of it, Ascochyta would be the one that would give me the most concern. And again, if you have above 10% levels of Ascochyta on your seed, then you definitely might want to consider making sure that you're changing up your seed lot a little bit, or by far increasing your seeding rate. Now, 10% is kind of the cutoff. You can definitely go higher than that if you want to increase your seeding rate, for sure. But that's kind of the number that we choose. I would say the same thing when it comes to mechanical and chemical damage too. If you have a lot of abnormals and you have a lot of damage due to mechanical or chemical, again, you need to think about what the effect that is having on that. Is it above, 15 to 20% of your seed that's not looking good, and you're going to have to increase your seeding rate to compensate for that? All of a sudden, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, and it might be smarter to switch to a different seed lot. So it kind of depends. Now, if you're some diseases such as, Ascochyta on chickpeas is very, very low, and you should change right away, like 1% even on chickpeas, and you need to think about, Ascochyta levels that high and changing your seed lot. So it just depends a little bit, but I think there's that fine line between a little bit of disease versus a lot of disease, and the cutoff falls in that 10 to 15%.
Okay, Kelly, I'll go to you for when we're talking now generally cereals, but if you want to pick on one, you certainly can. If we're talking, let's say, sprouting, frost damage, or a particular disease, is there a time where you say, no, we're switching out this seed lot?
I think you need to look at a combination of what's on the seed in terms of seed-borne disease, what level that is there, and then what the germination and vigor tests are indicating. And if your vigor or if your germination starts to creep below probably about 80%, 60, 70%, you're seeing an elevated level of things like Graminearum or the spot blotch fungus, you may look at changing your seed source. I think a lot of it does depend on seed supply issues. So if we look at 2016 and huge issues with wet conditions at harvest, a lot of crops stayed out in the field over the winter. There were a lot of concerns in 2017 in terms of seed availability. So if that's a consideration, you might be able to look at a seed lot that has quite a bit lower germination, maybe a little higher infection, and then up your seeding rate, make sure you use a good product, a good seed treatment, good seed technology. But very similar to what Robyne said, if you look at a lot of the seed-borne disease issues in cereals, so for instance, Fusarium graminearum, the recommendation, if you look at threshold levels in other countries, about 10% infection. Spot blotch fungus in barley, you're probably looking more at 30% seed infection before you'd start to use a seed treatment. And then if you look at things like net form, net blotch in barley, it's about 15% roughly is the threshold for seed treatment, not necessarily not using the seed. So I think it's important to look at both the germination and vigor and then what your fungal disease screen is indicating. And if you're starting to see those germinations creep much below 80, 70%, I might be looking at a new seed source, especially if you don't have any seed availability issues.
Right. Now, Peter, of course, is mentioning that this wouldn't happen in the East, but Peter neglects to mention that certified seed use in Ontario compared to Western Canada is through the roof. So that is also going to be a factor as well. And he shakes his head at us because he can't understand why such a thing would happen. I do have a question here about biofungicides, something like a mustard or something like that for soil fungicides. Is there any work that either of you are aware of in Alberta? I know that PEI has been doing some work because, of course, they've got potato land in rotation, which there are some in Alberta. Have either of you heard of any biofungicide work happening?
There was some work in terms of breeding out of Saskatoon, so that would have been Christine at Ag Canada there, and then Kevin Falk at Ag Canada also was the Nebraska Rapa breeder. So there's definitely interest in that. The impression I get from Kevin is that you'd have to go to either Carinata, so a product based on Carinata, or Gencia. High glucosinolate sort of Brassica napus may not necessarily have the glucosinolates. And basically it's a decomposition of that plant tissue and a release of products that have that sort of disease control impact. And if you look at Australia, they've done some work looking at using things like Gencia or other products in terms of things like take-all in wheat and so on. If you look at the prairie region and take-all, when I was a young pathologist in the mid-90s, we would see a lot of take-all in crops. And we get lots of calls. We don't necessarily see that now. And I wonder if, this canola wheat, some of that Brassica napus residue is maybe having an impact on that. But that's certainly, it's something that is definitely looking at an alternative to some of the other chemical-based soil fumigants that are very, very nasty. So it's interesting, certainly looking at the potential of it.
We're definitely looking at a lot of things in the pulses, Lyndsey. We have a lot of work being led by Dr. Shamar Chatterton out of Lethbridge, who has got a lot of different trials with cover crops and testing a lot of the brassicas and a lot of the Gencias and a lot of different mustards and weird stuff to try to do that. So we have been working on that for the past 4 or 5 years, and there's definitely some, initial results that are showing us that maybe Maybe, just maybe, but again, we need to look at the results after a longer period of 4 or 5 years to really get a good answer as to whether or not those are going to be tools for us, but definitely something we've been looking at.
Okay, and we're just about out of time here, and so this actually ties in quite well. Jason out of Manitoba has a question here, and there's two plant protein companies now looking for peas in particular on the prairies. Of course, this is also happening at the same time that Aphanomyces has popped up in rotation. So, are there other options intercropping with peas to potentially reduce pathogen loads or other crops in rotation? So, as these companies, as plant protein, as these plants are coming online, demanding more plant protein, this is great news. But how do we manage for Aphanomyces with those peas in rotation? Do we have intercropping options?
We have not done a lot of work on intercropping. I'll admit that right off the bat. It is something that we are looking at, though. We have some trials that started a couple of years ago, and we'll continue over the next couple of years looking at just that. But right now, I don't have any promising data that I can pass on. I can just say that there is potential there, but right now we don't. No.
And I will definitely say, I mean, it speaks to certainly many farmers have perhaps, are thinking about trying to get some more pulses into rotation in areas that maybe are less traditional. But even the traditional growing areas now have some challenges. So, this is good news for sure to add this processing on the prairies, but we've got to make sure the agronomy is there to support our farmers. And Kara says, Flixpea for the win. Yeah, I do like naming intercrops. I won't lie; it is quite fun when you start to mix them all up and give them a new name.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have. I think we did start a little late, but I think we're just a bit over time here. So I wanted to thank both my guests, Kelly Turkington and Robyne Bowness Davidson. Did I get that right?
You did.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yes.
I'm glad. So thank you both for joining us tonight. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you to all our viewers as well for all the questions and comments and the interaction. And of course, check out realagriculture.com for more. If you head straight to realagriculture.com/agronomists, you can see past episodes, and this episode will be up tomorrow morning. So thanks to both of you, and thank you to our audience for participating tonight. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks,
Thank
Lyndsey.
you. Bye-bye.
All right. Okay. Thanks so much for tuning in. Sean will be back next week. No idea what he's going to talk about. But do tune in Mondays, 8 p.m. Eastern, The Agronomists. We have a new topic and new experts every week. And as I mentioned, just head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists to get your CEU credits and to sign up for our e-newsletter. Good night, everybody.